Sarah Caldwell pressed her last 2 silver coins into her daughter's palm, closed the girl's fingers around them, and said, "Don't you cry, not in front of them." Outside, Cyrus Kane's men were already measuring the fence posts. 60 days. That was all she had left before they buried her name under his. She didn't know that the dusty, road-worn stranger sitting silent at her table, the one she'd just fed the last of her bread, was the man who'd signed that death warrant himself. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel and follow Sarah's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning Cyrus Kane's man nailed the foreclosure notice to Sarah Caldwell's front door, the summer heat was already unbearable before 9 o'clock. Sarah heard the hammer strikes from the kitchen. 3 hard blows, clean and deliberate, the kind a man makes when he wants to be heard. She set down the tin pot she was holding, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the front of the house without hurrying. That was the thing about Sarah. She never let a man see her run. The notice was printed on thick paper with official lettering at the top. She read it once. Then she pulled it from the nail with one firm tug, walked back inside, and held it over the iron stove until the corner caught flame. Abigail watched from the doorway. "Mama!" "Get the water bucket." "Mama, what was—" "Abigail?" Sarah's voice didn't rise. It just stopped everything else. "Get the bucket. We've got the west fence to check before noon." Abigail went. Sarah stood over the stove and watched the paper curl black and fall to ash. 60 days. That was what the letter said. She'd read every word before she burned it. 60 days to settle a debt of $430. A sum Robert had borrowed 3 years ago against the ranch, against the water rights, against everything, and never told her about until the bank sent their first notice 6 weeks after his burial. Robert. She breathed through her nose and kept her jaw set. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in 8 months, and she wasn't starting today. By mid-morning, Sarah and Abigail had ridden the western boundary fence and found 2 posts rotted clean through. Sarah dug them out herself, while Abigail held the horses. The summer sun was the kind that didn't just shine. It pressed down on you like a hand between your shoulder blades, steady and without mercy. "We're running low on flour," Abigail said. "I know. And the Hendersons said they won't extend credit again until—" "Abigail, I know." The girl fell quiet. She was 16, but she had her father's eyes, sharp and watchful, the kind that noticed everything and held it behind a calm face. Sometimes it was a comfort. Sometimes Sarah couldn't stand to be looked at that closely. They were riding back toward the house when they saw the man. He was on foot, coming up the road from the south, moving slow. His boots were worn through at the heel, his shirt dark with road dust and sweat. He had a hat pulled low against the sun and a canvas bag slung over one shoulder that didn't look like it held much of anything. Abigail pulled her horse up. "Mama!" "I see him. He doesn't look dangerous." Drifters never do until they are. But Sarah stopped her horse anyway, and the man lifted his eyes when he heard the hooves slow. He stopped walking. He didn't reach for anything, didn't take a threatening step. He just stood in the middle of the road and waited, the way a man does when he knows better than to spook a woman on horseback. "You lost?" Sarah called. "No, ma'am." His voice was low and unhurried. "Just walking." "To where?" "Nowhere particular." Sarah studied him for a moment. He wasn't young, wasn't old. Late 30s maybe, with a few days of beard, and the kind of tanned, weathered face that came from time outdoors, not from wealth or ease. His hands were hanging loose at his sides, and there was something about the stillness of him, not threatening stillness, but the kind that said he wasn't performing. "You know anything about fence posts?" she asked. He blinked. "Some. I've got 2 rotted through and a brother-in-law in Missouri who isn't coming. I'll feed you if you work. 1 meal, 1 night in the barn. Come morning, you move on." He looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am. That's fair. What's your name?" A beat. "Jack. Jack Callahan. I'm Mrs. Caldwell. The girl is Abigail. You address us both properly and give me no cause for concern, you'll eat tonight. You give me any cause at all, and you'll find out I shoot better than my husband did." Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, but close to one. "Understood, Mrs. Caldwell." His name was Jack Callahan. That was the only thing Sarah knew about him, and for now, it was the only thing she needed. He worked hard. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the way a man works when he's being watched, but the quiet, efficient kind of hard work that has no audience. By the afternoon, he had both fence posts reset and tamped down tight, had patched a gap in the horse paddock without being asked, and had carried 3 loads of split wood to the stack behind the kitchen door. Abigail watched him from the porch with that careful expression of hers. "He's strong," she said to her mother. "Most men are. That doesn't make them good." "He didn't ask for anything extra." "Not yet." But Sarah was watching him too, in the way she watched everything. Sideways, steady, taking note. There was something off about Jack Callahan. Not dangerous off, not the way Cyrus Kane's men were off, with their deliberate rudeness and their measuring eyes. This was different. The way he carried himself when he thought no one was looking. There was a kind of ease there, a straightness to his spine that didn't match his broken-down boots. The way he'd looked at the fence line, not just checking, but assessing, like a man used to knowing what things were worth. She filed it away and said nothing. Dinner was cornbread and salt pork, and she set 3 plates on the table without ceremony. Jack sat where she pointed and ate without complaint and kept his eyes on his own business. Abigail, as usual, was less careful. "Where'd you come from?" she asked. "South," he said. "How far south?" "Far enough." "That's not really an answer." "Abigail," Sarah said, "I'm just asking." Jack Callahan looked at the girl with that almost smile again. "Texas originally. Spent some time in Denver. Came up through Colorado." "What were you doing in Denver?" He paused just slightly. The kind of pause a person might not notice unless they were looking for it. Sarah noticed. "Business," he said. "What kind of business?" "Abigail." This time Sarah's tone had a different quality, and her daughter heard it and went quiet. Jack looked down at his plate. He said, "You make good cornbread, Mrs. Caldwell." "I make cornbread," she said. "Good is what you say when you've eaten worse." He looked up. "Then I've eaten worse." There was a brief silence, and then Abigail laughed despite herself. The sudden bright laugh of a 16-year-old who forgets to be guarded for just a moment. And even Sarah's expression shifted. Not a smile, but the shadow of one, barely there. Later, after Abigail had gone to bed, Sarah sat at the table with the ledger. This was the part of the day she dreaded most. The numbers that didn't move no matter how many times she looked at them. $41 and some cents in savings. A promissory note against the cattle that wouldn't be sold until fall. $430 owed to the Western Land and Mortgage Company by the first day of September. She pressed 2 fingers against her temple and stared at the page. The door between the kitchen and the back porch was open to let in the night air, and through it she could see the faint glow of the lantern she'd left in the barn for Jack Callahan. He'd been quiet going in, hadn't asked for more than a blanket, hadn't lingered.
This story was posted on the
She
channel
didn't know
west
why
of
that bothered
Betrayal.
her.
Please do not
It didn't
repost
bother
it in
her.
any form.
She was just tired.
She closed the ledger, blew out her lamp, and went to bed. And she did not think about the numbers again until 3 in the morning, when she woke up, already thinking about them. He was still there in the morning. She hadn't entirely expected that. Men like that, drifters, wanderers, men with no particular destination, they sometimes moved on in the night without a word, and she'd half prepared herself for an empty barn. But Jack Callahan was up before she was, and when she came out to start the morning chores, she found he'd already fed the horses and drawn water from the well, and was splitting wood in the gray early light, with the kind of focus that made it clear he'd been at it a while. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him. He didn't see her, or if he did, he didn't let on. "You were supposed to move on this morning," she said. He stopped mid-swing and looked over his shoulder. "You've got a loose shingle on the north side of the roof, going to let the rain in, and your wagon wheel's cracked on the left rear. You take it to town like that, you'll lose it on the road." Sarah crossed her arms. "That doesn't answer what I said." "No, ma'am, it doesn't." A long pause stretched between them. The horses moved in their stalls. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called once and stopped. "One more day," she said. "Shingle and the wheel." "Yes, ma'am." She turned back toward the house, then stopped. "Mr. Callahan." "Ma'am?" "I don't know your business, and I don't need to. But if you have business here, in this county, with anyone in this county, I need to know that before you stay under my roof." He lowered the axe. He turned fully toward her. In the early light, his face was hard to read. Not closed exactly, but careful. The kind of careful that costs something. "I don't have business in this county," he said. "Not anymore." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and went inside. Cyrus Kane came that afternoon. He came the way he always came, on a good horse, with 2 of his men trailing behind, making no pretense of politeness. He was 52 years old, thick-necked and deliberate, and he had the particular brand of confidence that came from having owned things his whole life, and never having had anyone take them back. Sarah was on the porch when he rode up. "Mrs. Caldwell." He didn't tip his hat. He never tipped his hat. "I trust you received my notice." "I received something," she said. "I don't recall what I did with it." His jaw tightened. He knew she'd burned it. She'd burned the first 2, and he knew that too. It was a game she played, the only kind of defiance that cost her nothing. "You've got 58 days, he said. $430. I want to offer you a clean solution before this goes further." "You've offered before." "This time I'm offering fair market." "Cyrus." She used his first name deliberately. It wasn't familiarity. It was refusal to grant him the formality he wanted. "Your fair market is whatever number makes the water rights fall in your lap. I know what my land is worth. I know what that spring is worth. And I know what happens to every family in this valley if you own it. That's not your concern. It is entirely my concern." His eyes moved then, past her, toward the side of the house where Jack Callahan had come around the corner at some point during the conversation. He was holding a hammer, and he wasn't moving toward anyone, wasn't posturing. He was just standing there, the way a man stands when he is making a point, without making a threat. Kane looked at him. "Who are you?" "Nobody," Jack said. "Just doing some work."
Kane looked back at Sarah with an expression she recognized. The particular displeasure of a man who expected a woman to be alone and vulnerable, and found something in the way.
"You've got 58 days, Sarah." He pulled his horse around. "And nobody can save this ranch from what's coming. Not a hired hand, not your brother-in-law in Missouri, not a miracle from heaven. Think about your daughter." He rode out. Sarah stood on the porch and watched him go, and did not move until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then Abigail's voice came from inside the house. "I hate him." "I know, baby." "He's going to take it, isn't he?" Sarah turned and walked back through the door. "Not today, he isn't." That night, after the fire had burned low, Abigail spoke from her cot in the room off the kitchen. "Mama, do you trust him?" Sarah was sewing by the last of the lamplight. "Who?" "Mr. Callahan." She set the needle through the fabric. "I don't trust anyone I've known for 2 days." "But you let him stay." "He's useful." "That's not the same thing." "No," Sarah agreed. "It isn't." A pause. "He watches things," Abigail said. "The way he looks at the property. Not like a drifter looks. Like he's adding it up." Sarah's needle stilled. "He looked at our water when we came back from the south fence. Just stood there, looking at the spring for a minute. Didn't know I was watching." Sarah set the sewing down in her lap and said nothing for a long moment. "Get some sleep," she said finally. "Mama." "Abigail. Sleep." The girl went quiet. Sarah sat alone in the low light of the kitchen, the unfinished sewing on her lap, and she looked at the wall for a long time, thinking about a man who held himself too straight for someone without money, who paused too long when he was asked about his work, who looked at a water spring the way a person looks at something that has value. "Not anymore," he had said. "I don't have business in this county. Not anymore." She picked up her sewing. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about Sarah Caldwell. Her hands were always steady, even when everything else was burning. The shingle was fixed by the next morning. The wagon wheel would need a new iron band and a day in town, Jack told her, and she said she'd send for the blacksmith. He nodded and went back to the paddock fence, where he'd found a third post working loose. And she watched him from the kitchen window and thought about what Abigail had said. He watches things. She had been watching him watch things. The spring, yes, he'd looked at it twice now. But also the fields, the cattle, the road. Not the way a man cases a property before he steals from it. More like a man taking inventory of something he already knows. She went out to him at mid-morning with a cup of water. He took it without making it into anything. "Thank you, ma'am." "Mr. Callahan." "Mrs. Caldwell." She stood beside him while he worked the post, neither of them in any hurry to speak. The summer heat built around them. In the field beyond, her remaining cattle, 12 head, all she had left, moved slowly in the shade of the cottonwoods. "What do you know about Western land and mortgage?" she asked. He didn't stop working, but his hands slowed for just a fraction of a second. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. "Denver-based outfit," he said. "Mostly land speculation. They buy debt, hold notes, foreclose when they can, and resell. They like water rights." He paused. "Particularly in Wyoming." She looked at him sideways. "That's a lot of detail for a man passing through." "It's a well-known outfit." "To who?" He set the post against the ground and looked up at her then, fully, for the first time. His eyes were darker than she'd realized, and steadier than they had any right to be on a man in worn-out boots. "To people in the business," he said. "What business is that, exactly?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Not one I'm proud of." It wasn't an answer, but it was the most honest thing he'd said to her yet, and something about that, the particular weight of it, made her step back and let the silence settle between them. "Lunch is at noon," she said. She walked
This
back to the
story
house.
was posted on the
Behind
channel
her,
west
she
of
heard him
Betrayal.
drive the post into
Please
the
do not
ground with
repost it
3
in any
solid
form.
strikes. She didn't ask him again that day. But that night, alone in her room with the window open and the summer dark pressing in warm and close, Sarah Caldwell lay awake with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not fear, exactly, and not hope, which she'd learned to be very careful with. Something else. The particular unease of a woman who has survived enough to know when a thing is not what it appears to be. Jack Callahan knew Western Land and Mortgage the way a man knows a place he has been. And he had looked at her spring the way a man looks at something he once believed was his. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the night sounds of the ranch, the cattle, the wind in the cottonwoods, the far-off call of something she couldn't identify. And she thought, "Who are you, Jack Callahan?" She thought it very quietly, the way you think things you're not ready to say out loud. Outside the barn window, the lantern burned low and eventually went dark. The next morning, Jack was gone before sunrise. Not gone. His canvas bag was still in the barn, his blanket folded neatly on the hay bale. But he wasn't in the yard, wasn't at the well, wasn't anywhere on the property that Sarah could see when she stepped out into the early heat with her coffee and looked around with the particular alertness of a woman who had learned to notice what was missing. Abigail came out behind her. "He leave? His bag's still here. That doesn't mean anything." "It means something," Sarah said, and went back inside. He came back 2 hours later on foot, same as he'd arrived, his boots dusty from the road. He didn't explain where he'd been, and Sarah didn't ask. Not right away. She handed him a plate of biscuits and watched him eat, and waited until he was on his second biscuit before she said, "You went to town." He looked up. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He set the biscuit down. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation exactly. More like a man choosing his words with care. "Wanted to know what they're saying about your property." Sarah went very still. "Who's they?" "Kane's men. They drink at the saloon on Tuesdays." He picked the biscuit back up. "They're saying he's already got a buyer lined up for the water rights. Denver investor. Deal closes the day after your note comes due." The kitchen was quiet enough that she could hear the clock on the mantel. "He's had that buyer since before he served me the notice," she said. It wasn't the question. "Looks that way." "So the 60 days wasn't an offer. It was a formality." Jack Callahan looked at her across the table with those steady, dark eyes. "Yes, ma'am. That's what it looks like." Sarah stood up and walked to the window. She stood there with her back to him, and her arms crossed, and she breathed through the particular cold fury of finding out a thing you already suspected but were still hoping was wrong. "Who is the Denver investor?" she asked. A pause longer than the others. "Hasn't come up yet. But you're going to find out. I was thinking on it." She turned around. "Mr. Callahan, I don't know you. I don't know what you want here. And I don't know why a man without a horse and with nothing but a canvas bag knows this much about land speculation outfits and saloon gossip." She kept her voice level and direct. "But I need you to understand something. If you are working for Cyrus Kane, if any part of what you're doing here is aimed at getting information about my land or my debts or my situation, you need to tell me right now. Because I would rather face this alone than with the wrong person standing next to me." He didn't look away. He didn't shift or soften or try to fill the silence with reassurance. "I'm not working for Kane," he said. "Then who are you working for?" The clock ticked. "Right now?" He looked down at his plate. "You." It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But there was something in the flatness of it. No charm, no sell, just the bare word, that she couldn't call a lie, even if she wanted to. "Finish your breakfast," she said. "The south pasture gate needs new hinges." He fixed the gate and the shingle and the wheel, and then he found 3 more things that needed fixing. And Sarah let him, because the work was real and the ranch needed it, and she was not in a position to turn away useful hands on principle. But she watched him. She watched him the way she watched the weather, not with fear, but with attention, the constant, quiet cataloging of a woman who understood that things changed without warning, and that the only protection was paying close enough attention to see it coming. What she noticed: he worked harder than he needed to impress someone. He asked her before he touched anything that wasn't obviously broken. He spoke to Abigail with the same brief, direct respect he gave Sarah herself, without the particular condescension that most men couldn't keep out of their voice when they talked to a teenage girl. And twice more she caught him looking at the spring. The second time she walked up behind him and said, "Say what you're thinking." He startled, genuinely, and that surprised her, because she hadn't expected to catch him off guard. He turned around, and for a moment his face was unguarded in a way it hadn't been before, and she saw something in it that she couldn't quite name. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that whoever owns that water owns this whole valley." "I know that." "And I was thinking that Cain doesn't actually need the water. He's not a rancher, not anymore. He's a broker." His jaw tightened. "He's going to sell it. To someone who'll dam it, or restrict it, or charge every family around here to use it. And inside of 5 years, this valley will be cleared out, and there'll be nothing left but one man's cattle operation and a lot of empty homesteads." Sarah stared at him. "You say that like you've seen it happen." His expression shifted, closed back down. "I have," he said. Then, quieter, "I've seen it happen more than once." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "Lunch in an hour," and walked away. And she thought about the way his face had opened for just that 1 second. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it. The look of a man accounting for something. It was Abigail who pushed it. She had her father's instincts, that girl. The same way of walking right at the edge of a thing until it fell open. She cornered Jack at the paddock fence late that afternoon, while Sarah was inside, going over the ledger for the 4th time that week, as if the numbers might change if she looked at them hard enough. Sarah heard their voices through the open window. Not the words at first, just the back-and-forth rhythm of a conversation that wasn't small talk. She set down her pencil. "I found something," Abigail was saying. "In your bag." A silence. "You went through my bag." Jack's voice was flat. "I wasn't snooping. I was checking if your blanket needed washing, and it fell out." A pause. "It's a business card from Western Land and Mortgage Company, Denver office, with your name on it." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Sarah was on her feet before she knew she'd stood up. She walked to the back door and pushed it open and stepped into the yard, and both of them turned to look at her. Abigail's face was tight and wary. Jack's was still, very still. The particular stillness of a man who has stopped deciding what to say next, because there's nothing left to decide. Sarah looked at him. "Talk." He looked back at her, and for the first time since he'd walked up that road with his worn-out boots and his canvas bag, he didn't look steady. He looked like a man who had known this was coming and had not fully prepared for it anyway. "Mrs. Caldwell, the card," she said. "Is it yours?" A beat. "Yes." "You work for Western Land and Mortgage." "Worked," he said. Past tense. "How past?" He exhaled through his nose. 3 months. Abigail made a sound, not words, just the sharp exhale of someone who'd been hoping they were wrong. Sarah did not make a sound. She stood perfectly still in the summer heat and looked at Jack Callahan. and felt the cold thing move through her chest. Not just anger, though the anger was there, hard
This story
and
was
immediate,
posted on the
but
channel
the
west of
particular
Betrayal.
sickness of having
Please
been
do not
foolish,
repost it in any
of
form.
having looked at this man every day for a week and cooked his food and let him stay, and told herself she was being careful, while he sat at her table with his past in his bag, 10 feet from her daughter's cot. "Get off my property," she said. "Sarah? Mrs. Caldwell?" Her voice was flat and absolute. "You do not have the right to use my name. Get your bag and get off my land." "Please." He took one step forward, and she took one step back, and he stopped immediately, both hands up. "Please, just let me explain one thing. You don't have anything to say that I want to hear." "The note," he said. "Your husband's debt, the original note." He said it fast, before she could speak again. "I know what it says."
I know the original terms, and I know what was changed after it was signed, and I know who changed it. And if you don't hear it from me, you're never going to hear it at all." Sarah stopped. The air felt different, the way air feels when something shifts in it that can't be put back. "What do you mean, changed?" she said. He lowered his hands. His voice was steady again, but the steadiness cost him something. She could hear it. "The original note your husband signed was for $200 at 8% over 4 years. Standard terms. Reasonable. He could have paid it." He paused. "After he died, someone altered the documentation, raised the principal to 430, and changed the due date. Made it look like he'd borrowed more than he did. The world narrowed down to a single point." "How do you know that?" "Because I worked in that office for 2 years. Because I saw the original." He stopped. Then, very quietly, "Because I know who authorized the change." Abigail breathed out slowly. "Who?" He looked at Sarah. "Not Abigail. Sarah. Cyrus Kane doesn't just hold your note, Mrs. Caldwell. He bought it from Western Land after your husband died. And then he changed it. He's been planning this for 3 years. This was never about a debt. It was about the spring." The silence was complete. Sarah's hands were at her sides. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. "And you," she said very carefully. "Where were you in all of this?" He didn't look away. She had to give him that. He did not look away from what he'd walked into. "I was in the Denver office when the paperwork came through," he said. "I didn't know at the time what property it was attached to, or what it meant. By the time I understood what they were doing with these kinds of notes, what happened to the families behind them, I'd already processed dozens." His jaw worked. "I left. 3 months ago. I left and I came north, and I've been working my way through every county where I know they have active notes." "Doing what?" Sarah said. "Trying to find out what I can prove." "Can you prove it? What they did to Robert's note?" A pause. "Not yet. I have my own records, but the original documents are in Denver." "Then you have nothing." "I have knowledge," he said. "I know the people involved. I know where the original documents were filed before they were changed. I know who signed off." He stopped. "I can help you fight this, Mrs. Caldwell. Not by paying your debt. I don't have that kind of money anymore. But by knowing where to look and who to push and what questions a lawyer needs to ask." Sarah stared at him for a long, unmoving moment. Then she turned and walked back into the house. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the surface. She stared at the wall, and she breathed. In and out. In and out. And she let the whole shape of it settle over her. Robert's debt wasn't even real. The number hanging over her, the number she had been lying awake at night trying to solve, the number that Cyrus Kane had used to measure her family's future. It had been manufactured. assembled out of greed and paper and a dead man's signature. She heard Abigail come in behind her. "Mama?" "I know." "He's still standing out there." "I know that too." A long pause. "Is he telling the truth?" Abigail asked. Sarah thought about the business card. She thought about the way he'd looked at the spring. She thought about the pause before he said, "business," and the way he'd said, "not one I'm proud of," like a man who meant it exactly. She thought about a dead man who had borrowed $200 and somehow died owing more than twice that. "I think he is," she said. "That doesn't mean we can trust him." "No," Sarah agreed. "It doesn't," she stood up, "but it means we need to hear the rest of it." She went back outside. Jack was where she'd left him, standing by the paddock fence. He hadn't moved toward the barn to get his bag. He hadn't moved anywhere. Just standing, waiting, the way he'd stood in the road the first day. Patient, like a man who understood that some things had to run their course before they could be answered. Sarah stopped 6 feet from him. "Tell me the name of the man who signed off on the change to Robert's note." He told her. The name meant nothing to her. She'd never heard it. But she watched his face when he said it, the particular tightness around his eyes, and she thought, he hates that man. Not the uncomplicated hatred of someone pointing a finger away from himself. The more complicated kind. The kind that included knowing you stood in the same building and cashed the same paychecks. "What do you want from this?" she asked. "Nothing." "That's not an answer." "It's the truth." He looked at her. "I can't give you back what they took from your husband's reputation. I can't give your daughter a year of sleep that wasn't broken by worry. I can't fix the thing I was part of by standing in your yard." He stopped. "But I can try to give you a fighting chance, if you'll let me." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "You stay in the barn," she said. "You work for your meals. You tell me everything you know about that documentation, and you tell me the name of every person in that company who can be made to answer for it." She kept her voice level and even, and left no room in it for misunderstanding. "And if I find out, on any day, at any point, that you have lied to me or misled me, or put my daughter at risk through any action or omission, I will not ask you to leave. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." "Then get back to work. The north fence still needs checking." He picked up the tools. He walked toward the fence line without another word, without looking back. Abigail appeared at Sarah's shoulder. "You're trusting him." "I'm using him," Sarah said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Sarah watched Jack Callahan move down the fence line and thought about a document in a Denver office that could save her land, and about the man who'd once helped process papers that destroyed families and was now trying to do something about it, with nothing but his own word and worn-out boots. "Sometimes," she said, "the difference is smaller than you'd like." That night, after Abigail slept, Sarah sat at the table and Jack sat across from her, and he talked for 2 hours. He talked about how Western land worked, the mechanics of it, the way they identified properties with clean water access or mineral potential, and then bought up existing debt and manipulated terms. He talked about the men in the Denver office, their names and their positions and their habits. He told her about the filing system, where originals were kept versus copies, which clerk had access to what. Sarah listened and asked questions, and wrote things down, and asked more questions. And by midnight, she had 4 pages of notes in her own careful handwriting, and a picture in her mind of the machinery that had been running against her family for 3 years without her knowing. At some point she realized she'd stopped watching his face for signs of dishonesty, and started just listening. She caught herself and went back to watching. There's
This
a lawyer
story
in
was
Cheyenne,
posted on the
Jack
channel
said.
west of
Name
Betrayal.
of Merritt.
Please do not
He's
repost
handled
it
cases
in
like
any
this
form.
before. He won one 2 years ago against a land company out of Kansas. Similar altered documentation. He'd know what to look for. How much? More than you have, he said honestly. But if we can show him the shape of the case, he might work on contingency. We. She noticed the word and let it pass without comment. I'll write to him, she said. I can ride to Cheyenne. Be there in 2 days. No. Firm and immediate. Not yet. Not until I know more about what you're bringing to him. She met his eyes across the table. I need to know what happened to the other families you said you tried to help. A silence fell between them. Jack looked down at the table. Some of them I got to in time. 2 families in Colorado, 1 in Nebraska. He paused. 2 I was too late for. How late? Already out. Land sold, families gone. Sarah let the weight of that sit for a moment. And the ones you helped, how did it end? One case is still moving through the courts. The other they settled. Not as much as they deserved, but enough to keep their land. He looked up. It can be done, Mrs. Caldwell. It is not a sure thing, and it is not fast, and it is not without risk, but it can be done. She held his gaze across the table. You're going to tell me everything, she said. Every name, every detail, everything you know. And I'm going to write to Merritt myself, with your information and my own account of what's happened here. And I'm going to let him tell me if there's a case. Yes, ma'am. And if he says there isn't, then we find another way. The we again. She let it pass again. Sarah gathered her notes and stood. Get some sleep, Mr. Callahan. Yes, ma'am. He stood as well, picked up his hat from the table, moved toward the door. Jack. He stopped. Robert was a good man, she said. He wasn't smart about money, and he trusted people he shouldn't have. And he kept things from me that he should have told me. And I was furious at him for months after he died. She paused. But he was a good man, and he didn't deserve what they did to his name. I want that on the record. Whatever comes next, I want that on the record. Jack Callahan stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and something moved across his face that was neither an almost smile nor the careful blankness she'd grown used to. It was something quieter and more unguarded than either. Yes, ma'am, he said. It'll be on the record. He went out. Sarah sat back down at the table and looked at the 4 pages of notes in front of her. 4 pages of names and dates and filing codes and the shape of a crime laid out in plain language. And for the first time in 8 months, she felt something other than the cold arithmetic of survival. It wasn't hope. She was still too careful for hope, but it was the thing that lived just next door to it. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't wake up at 3 in the morning. The letter to Merritt went out on a Thursday. Sarah rode to town herself to post it, which was a statement in itself. In the 3 weeks since Kane had served her the notice, she'd been avoiding Harlow as much as she could. Small towns had a way of reading a woman's desperation in her face and turning it into gossip, and she had no patience for either the pity or the speculation. But this was different. This felt like action, and action required showing up. She handed the envelope to the postmaster, paid her 2 cents, and walked back out into the summer heat without making eye contact with anyone. She almost made it. Mrs. Caldwell. She stopped, turned. Dora Hatch was standing outside the dry goods store with a basket on her arm and the particular expression of a woman who had something to say and had been waiting for the opportunity.
Dora was 50, married to the man who ran the feed store, and had lived in Harlow long enough to know everything about everyone, and the particular talent for delivering that knowledge in a way that sounded like concern. "I heard Cyrus was out at your place again," Dora said. "He was. You know people are talking." "People always are." Dora stepped closer, lowering her voice with the false intimacy of someone who enjoys delivering hard news. "They're saying you've got a man staying at your ranch. A drifter." "I've got a hired hand," Sarah said, "as do most ranches." "A hired hand you've known for less than 2 weeks." Dora paused. "With Robert barely a year in the ground." The heat pressed down between them. Sarah looked at Dora Hatch for a long, flat moment, long enough to make the woman's certainty waver slightly at the edges. "Dora," she said, "I have 51 days to save my land and my daughter's future. I don't have a single one of them to spend on this conversation." She picked up her reins. "Give my regards to your husband." She rode home without looking back. Jack was at the paddock when she got back, working with the older of the 2 horses, running his hands down the animal's left foreleg with the focused attention of someone who knew what he was doing. "She's favoring it," he said without looking up. "Not bad yet. Needs rest and a poultice." "I know," Sarah dismounted. "I noticed it yesterday. I can manage it. I've done it before." She handed him the reins to the other horse without comment and went inside. And she didn't say anything about Dora Hatch or the talk in town. There was nothing to say. People would talk, and the ranch would either be saved or it wouldn't. And neither outcome had anything to do with Dora Hatch's basket or her opinions. Abigail was at the table when Sarah came in, a book open in front of her, but her eyes not on the page. She looked up with that expression she'd been wearing more frequently, the one that meant she'd been thinking hard about something and was deciding whether to say it. "Say it," Sarah said. "What if Merritt says no?" "Then we find someone who says yes." "And if there's no one?" Sarah set her hat on the hook by the door. "Then we fight with what we have." "Which is what, exactly?" Abigail's voice wasn't sharp. It was the voice of someone genuinely trying to count the pieces. "We have Jack's word. We have his notes. We don't have the original documents. We don't have a lawyer. We don't have money." "We have $41 and the truth," Sarah said. "That's not nothing." Abigail looked back at her book. "It's not enough either." Sarah sat down across from her daughter and put her hands flat on the table. "Abigail, look at me." The girl looked up. "We are not giving up this land. I need you to hold on to that, not as hope, not as a wish, as a fact. We are not giving it up, whatever it takes. You understand me?" A long moment passed. "Yes, ma'am," Abigail said quietly. "Good." Sarah stood. "Now help me with supper." The reply from Merritt came 9 days later. Sarah saw the envelope in the postmaster's hand before he said a word, and she felt something tighten in her chest that she refused to identify as fear. She took the letter outside before she opened it, stood in the full summer sun, and read it straight through without pausing. Then she read it again. Merritt was interested. That was the word he used. Interested. In the careful language of a lawyer who didn't commit to more than he could deliver. He wanted details. He wanted Jack's documentation. He wanted dates, names, amounts, and the name of the clerk who had handled the file. He said the alteration of a debt instrument was fraud under Wyoming territorial law, and that if the evidence was sufficient, the note itself could be voided. He said he had worked a similar case 18 months prior. He also said his initial retainer was $300. Sarah folded the letter and put it in her pocket and stood in the heat for a minute. $300. She had 41.
This story was
She
posted on
wrote
the
home.
channel west of Betrayal. Please do not
Jack
repost
read the
it
letter
in
at
any
the kitchen
form.
table while Sarah and Abigail sat across from him. He read it the way he did most things, quietly, completely, without reaction, until he was done. "The retainer," Sarah said. "I know." "I don't have it." "I know that too." He set the letter down. "I have some money. Not much. About $60. He paused. "I know it's not—" "I'm not taking your money," Sarah said immediately. "It's not charity. It's—" "I know what you'd call it. I'm telling you what it is." Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "You've already given me information worth more than $60. That's one kind of debt, and I'm already carrying enough of another kind. I won't add to it." Jack looked at her for a moment. He didn't argue. She appreciated that more than she expected to. "Then we need another way to make up the difference," he said. "What can you sell?" It was such a direct, practical question that it almost made her laugh. "The cattle, but not until fall. That's the only way to get fair price. Selling now would get me half of what they're worth." "Jewelry? Anything your husband left?" "His watch. Maybe $12. "What about the other ranchers? Neighbors?" Abigail said, "The Tollivers might lend something. They've been fair to us." Sarah shook her head. "The Tollivers are fighting their own problems. Kane's been pressuring them over the East Road access. I won't put that on them." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then, "Let me go back to town." "To do what?" "There's a man named Aldous Webb who runs freight between here and Cheyenne. He's been looking for someone to drive a wagon north next week. His regular man's down with a broken hand." He looked at her steadily. "I can drive freight. It's 4 days round trip. Pays $30. "You'd come back," Abigail said. Not a question, not exactly. Something in between. Jack looked at her. "Yes." Abigail looked at her mother. Sarah studied Jack's face and thought about all the ways that sentence could be a lie. Then she thought about the way he'd said Robert was a good man, and it'll be on the record, and the particular quality of voice a person can't fake at the end of a long day after 2 hours of testimony. "Go see Webb," she said. "Come back with the terms, and I'll decide." He left the next morning. His canvas bag was still in the barn. Sarah noticed. She didn't say anything about it. He was back by noon with the terms. $32, leaving Tuesday, back Saturday. Sarah said yes. Jack left Tuesday at first light, and Sarah watched the road for a while after, and then went back to work, because there was always work, and standing in a yard watching an empty road was not something she had time for. But it was a strange 4 days. The ranch felt different without him, and she didn't like that it felt different, because it meant she'd gotten used to his presence faster than was sensible for a woman in her position. She caught herself, twice, starting to call out something about the fence, and then remembering he wasn't there. Abigail didn't say anything about it, but she had that watchful expression every time Sarah came in from the yard. On the third day, Cyrus Kane came back. He came alone this time, which was different. And he tied his horse at the post with the air of a man who had decided on a different approach. "Mrs. Caldwell," he tipped his hat. Actually tipped it, which was its own kind of warning. "I've come to make a final offer." "You've made final offers before." "This one is different." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. $300, cash, for the note and a quitclaim on the spring rights. You keep the rest of the property free and clear. No debt, no foreclosure, no lawyers. $300. Sarah's face gave nothing away. She had spent enough years keeping her face still in front of difficult men that it came naturally now, the way breathing did. But inside she was moving very quickly through the calculations. $300, free and clear, the house and the land and the cattle. No spring rights, which meant no water control, which meant Kane would dam or sell within the year, and she'd be ranching without reliable water access. And she heard in her memory Jack's voice from 2 weeks ago. He's going to sell it, and inside of 5 years this valley will be cleared out. "Who's your Denver buyer?" she asked. Kane blinked, just slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "The investor, the one you've had lined up since before you served me the notice." She kept her voice conversational. "I'm curious what they're paying for the water rights, given that you're willing to part with 300 just to make me go away quietly." The air between them changed. Kane's jaw set in that way it did when he was recalibrating. She'd seen it before. The small adjustment of a man who is used to being in control of the information in a room. "I don't know what you've been told, Sarah," Mrs. Caldwell, "but whatever stories you're hearing about my business arrangements, they're not relevant to your situation. This is a straightforward debt resolution." "It's not straightforward at all," she said, "and I think you know that." A beat. 2. The summer heat pressed down on both of them. "You've got 39 days, Kane said. The warmth had left his voice. "Think carefully." "I always do." He rode out. Sarah stood on the porch and watched him, and felt the fear move through her like cold water. Not the kind that paralyzed, but the kind that clarified. He'd offered 300 because he was nervous. Something had shifted in him since the last visit. Some calculation had changed, and he was trying to close this before... Before what? Before whatever she was doing started to look dangerous to him. She went inside and wrote everything down, every word of the conversation, and added it to the file she'd been building since the night Jack sat at her table and talked for 2 hours. Jack came back Saturday morning as promised, dusty from the road and $32 heavier. He handed her the money the moment he walked in, didn't make anything of it, didn't wait to be asked. She took it the same way, practical, clean, no ceremony. Added it to the 41 and Robert's watch money, which she'd gotten $14 for from the jeweler in town. $87. Still $213 short of Merritt's retainer. She told Jack about Kane's visit while they ate. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "He's scared," Jack said. "That's what I thought." Which means he knows the documentation is vulnerable. If he was completely clean, he'd let the 60 days run out and take his foreclosure. He wouldn't be here offering cash. He looked at her across the table. Someone talked. "About what?" "About me." His voice was flat. "About why I'm here." Sarah set her fork down. "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone in Harlow has connected me to my previous employment and passed that along to Kane. Which means he knows I have knowledge about his arrangement with Western Land." He paused. "He'll start digging. He'll find out what I told you. And when he does, he is going to try to make this very uncomfortable for you." "How uncomfortable?" Abigail said from the corner of the room, where she'd been quietly sitting the whole time. "Uncomfortable enough that you might rather take the 300 and let it go?" Abigail stood up straight. "He can't threaten us." "He doesn't threaten," Jack said. "He pressures. He withdraws credit, calls in favors, makes it hard for you to do business in town. He's done it before." He looked at Sarah. "I need you to understand what staying in this fight might cost you. Not just money." "I understand," Sarah said. "Every person in this valley who's been quiet about what he does to the water rights, they'll get quieter. Because the ones who speak up tend to find things getting harder for them." "I understand," she said again, quieter but no less firm. "Are you trying to talk me out of this?" "No," he said immediately. "I'm trying to make sure you know what you're walking into. I've been walking into it for 8 months.
I didn't have a choice then, and I don't have one now. The only thing that's changed is that I
This
have a
story was
direction."
posted on the channel
She
west
met
of
his eyes.
Betrayal. Please do not
How do we get
repost
to
it
Merritt's
in any
retainer?
form.
He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Aldous Webb has another run next week. I can take it." "That's 30 more." "And I have 60. "I told you it's not charity," he said, and there was something in his voice that was harder than usual. Not aggressive, just final. "I told you in the beginning I wasn't here to pay your debt. I'm not. I'm here to help you prove that the debt is fraudulent. This money is paying for legal work on a case that I should have prevented from ever existing." He paused.
"Let me help."
Abigail looked at her mother. Sarah looked at Jack for a long, careful moment. At his face, his hands, the particular quality of a man who has stopped performing and is just saying what is true. "After the second freight run," she said. "Yes. We contact Merritt. Yes. And you tell him everything. Every name, every detail, everything you know about that Denver office. You don't hold anything back." Something crossed his face. A kind of relief, maybe, that had been waiting a long time. "No, ma'am. Nothing held back." The second freight run was supposed to be simple. Jack left Monday. He was supposed to be back Thursday. Thursday came and went, and the road was empty. And Sarah cooked dinner and told Abigail he'd probably been delayed by weather or a wheel problem, and told herself the same thing, and believed it about halfway. Friday morning she sent Abigail to do the milking, and walked out to the road and stood there for 10 minutes looking south. Nothing. She went back to work. Friday noon, a rider came up the road. Not Jack, but a boy from town, one of the Webb's stable hands, 14 years old and breathing fast from the ride. "Mrs. Caldwell," he was trying to control his voice. "Mr. Webb sent me. There was some trouble on the road north." Sarah's hands went still. "What kind of trouble?" "3 men. They stopped the wagon outside of Miller's Creek." The boy swallowed. "Mr. Callahan's all right, ma'am. He's all right." But they took the freight money, and they roughed him up pretty good, and Webb's man found him on the road this morning. "Where is he now?" "Doc Pearson's, in town." She had her horse saddled in 4 minutes. He looked worse than she'd expected. A cut above his left eye, stitched closed. A bruised jaw that had swelled and darkened. Ribs wrapped tight. 2 cracked, Pearson said, from repeated kicks once he was down. He was sitting up when she came in, which was something, and his eyes were clear, which was more. "Mrs. Caldwell," his voice was rough. "Who were they?" Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "What happened?" She could see what happened. "Who sent them?" His good eye looked at her steadily. "They didn't introduce themselves." "Did you recognize any of them?" "One," he paused. "He rides for Kane." The room went quiet. Doc Pearson looked between them and found something on the other side of the room that needed his attention. "He sent men to beat you on a public road," Sarah said. "He sent men to send a message." Jack's jaw tightened. "The message being that people who carry certain kinds of information in this county tend to have accidents." "Then the information is valuable, more valuable than I thought." He looked at her. "He knows I have documentation, Sarah. Someone told him what I showed you. He's scared enough to make a move this stupid, which means we're close enough to something real that he needs to stop us before we get to Cheyenne." She finished it for him, thinking fast, everything clicking into place. "He wasn't trying to warn you off. He was trying to take the documents." Jack's expression shifted. "They searched the wagon. Did they find anything?" "No." A brief pause. "I don't carry the originals on the road." "Where are they?" He held her gaze for a moment. Your barn, behind the third post on the left side, wrapped in oilskin. Sarah stood perfectly still for 1 second. Then she turned and walked to the door. Sarah. She stopped. He'd used her name. She turned back. His face was bruised and careful and stripped of its usual stillness. Just a man in a bad chair, telling her something true.
Be careful going back. Don't ride the main road. She held his gaze for a moment. You called me Sarah. He looked at her, said nothing. She left. She rode home by the creek path, the long way, the one that went through the cottonwoods and came out behind the north pasture. She rode fast, with her eyes on the road ahead and her heart somewhere between fury and something she didn't name. And when she reached the barn, she went straight to the third post on the left. The oilskin package was there. She unwrapped it with careful hands. Inside were 12 pages of documents, ledger copies, correspondence, internal memos, 2 originals with letterhead, signed. A record of the transaction that turned Robert's $200 loan into a $430 death sentence, with the authorizing signature clear and unambiguous at the bottom. She looked at the name on that signature for a long time. Then she wrapped it back up and put it inside her dress, and walked into the house and sat down at the table and did not move for a while. He had kept the documents. He had come back. He had hidden the proof behind her barn post, like it was something worth protecting, even at the cost of cracked ribs. She looked at the wall. Outside, the summer afternoon went on. The cattle, the wind, the meadowlark. The same sounds they'd always been, but they meant something different now. They meant this was still hers, still standing. Abigail came in from the yard, stopped when she saw her mother's face. What happened? She said. Sarah looked up. Get me the writing paper. Mama, what, Abigail? Her voice was the steady one, the one that had no give in it. Get the paper. We're writing to Merritt tonight. And in the morning, I'm going back to town. For what? Sarah laid the oilskin package on the table. Abigail looked at it, back at her mother. Is that, Sarah said, is everything we need. The letter to Merritt went out before sunrise. Sarah rode to town in the gray early light before the heat built, before the streets filled, before anyone who reported to Cyrus Kane had reason to be watching the post office. She paid the postage, handed the envelope across the counter, and was back on the creek road before the postmaster had finished his coffee. The letter contained 3 things: a summary of the case in Sarah's own words, a list of every name Jack had given her, dates, positions, transaction numbers, and a single sentence at the end that she had written and rewritten 4 times before she was satisfied with it. I have original documentation supporting every claim in this letter, and I am prepared to deliver it to your office in person. She hadn't told Jack she was sending the documents along. The original stayed inside her dress until she reached home, and then she moved them from the oilskin wrap to the tin box she kept behind the loose hearthstone, the same place she'd kept Robert's important papers and her mother's ring, and the $41 that had felt like a wall between her family and ruin. It felt different putting the documents there, not like hiding something, like loading a weapon. Jack came back from Doc Pearson's that afternoon. He came on foot, same as always, moving slower than usual, with his ribs wrapped and his jaw still darkened with bruising. He didn't ask for help getting down from the horse Webb's stable hand had lent him, and Sarah didn't offer. She watched him tie the horse and walk to the porch, and she handed him a cup of coffee when he got to the steps. You should have stayed another day, she said. Pearson charged by the day. He took the coffee. I couldn't afford 3. I would have paid it. I know. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. That's why I didn't ask. They stood on the porch
This story
for a
was
moment,
posted
in the
on the
particular
channel
silence
west
that
of
had
Betrayal.
developed between them
Please
over the
do not
past weeks.
repost it in any form.
Not uncomfortable, not easy either, just honest. The kind of silence that forms between two people who have stopped performing for each other. I sent the letter, she said, to Merritt. When? This morning, before light. He nodded slowly. Good. I told him I have the originals, that I'd bring them to Cheyenne. Something moved in his face. Sarah, don't argue with me about the risk. I wasn't going to. He paused. I was going to say, be careful who you tell between now and then. Kane already knows the documents exist. If he finds out you have them, he won't send men to a road this time. What will he send? A lawyer, or a sheriff. His voice was level. He has friends in the county sheriff's office. If he can make a case that you're in possession of stolen property, documents taken from a private company's files, he might try to have them seized before you reach Cheyenne. Abigail, standing in the doorway behind them, said, Can he do that? He can try, Jack said. It would be wrong and it wouldn't hold up. But he doesn't need it to hold up. He just needs to delay you past your deadline. 31 days. That was what Sarah had left. She turned that over in her mind, the way she turned every hard thing over, looking at all the sides of it, not letting the fear have more room than the facts deserved. Then we move fast, she said. Merritt's reply came in 6 days, which was fast enough that Sarah knew he'd written back the same day he received her letter. He wrote that the documentation she described, if authentic, constituted clear evidence of fraudulent alteration of a debt instrument under Wyoming territorial statute. He wrote that he had handled 2 similar cases and had contacts in the territorial court who were, in his words, not sympathetic to the kind of land speculation practices you have described. He wrote that he was prepared to take the case on a reduced retainer of $150, given the strength of the evidence, with the remainder contingent on recovery. $150. Sarah read the letter twice, then read it to Jack and Abigail. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table and looked at each other. They had $87. 63 short, Abigail said. I know arithmetic, Sarah said. Jack said, I can do another freight run. Your ribs aren't healed. They're healed enough. Jack, she used his name without thinking about it, the way she'd started doing somewhere in the last week, without noticing the shift. I'm not sending you back on that road so Kane's men can finish what they started. They won't try it twice. Too much attention the first time. You don't know that. No, he agreed. I don't. He looked at her steadily. But you need $63 in the next 3 weeks, and your cattle won't sell at fair price until fall, and your neighbor's credit is tied up. What's the other option? She looked at him. He looked back. Abigail said, very quietly, The Tollivers. Both of them turned. The girl was looking at the table. I know what you said about not putting our problems on them, but Mrs. Tolliver told me 2 weeks ago that if we ever needed anything, we only had to ask. She said it like she meant it. She looked up. And if Kane takes our spring, it's their problem too. They're downstream. They know that. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She thought about Margaret Tolliver, who had come to Robert's burial with a pan of cornbread and stayed to help Sarah wash dishes afterward without being asked. She thought about Ed Tolliver, who had helped her get the cattle in last October when the hands quit, and said afterward, You don't owe me a thing, Sarah. This is just what neighbors do. She thought about what it cost to ask. It cost a lot. She knew exactly what it cost. I'll ride over tomorrow morning, she said. Margaret Tolliver didn't let her finish the explanation. She was in her kitchen, and Sarah was barely 3 sentences in when Margaret reached under the counter and pulled out a tin and set it on the table, and opened it and started counting. Margaret, Ed and I talked about this last week, Margaret said, still counting. When we heard about what Kane's men did to your man on the road. Ed said then that if you hadn't come to us yet, it was because you were being too proud, and I said I'd give you a few more days. She finished counting and pushed a stack of bills across the table. $70. It's what we can spare without hurting ourselves. Sarah looked at the money. We are downstream, Margaret said, sitting down. Every family in this valley knows what happens if Kane gets that spring. They're just scared. Some of them have debts to him, too. She folded her hands on the table. You're not doing this just for yourself, Sarah. You know that. Sarah looked at her friend's face, the plain, honest face of a woman who had lived hard in this country and never let it make her small. I'll pay it back, Sarah said. You'll pay it forward, Margaret said. That's how we do it out here. Sarah took the money. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. But riding home, she let herself feel the full weight of it. The $70 in her pocket, the documents behind the hearthstone, the letter from Merritt sitting on the kitchen table, all of it coming together, the way things sometimes did when you refused to let go. And she felt something that she had been keeping at a careful distance for 8 months. She felt like she might win. She didn't let herself feel it for long, but she let herself feel it. She wrote to Merritt that evening and told him she'd be in Cheyenne in 10 days with the documents and the retainer. She sealed the letter, and this time she gave it to Jack to ride to town with, because she wanted her own face off the streets until she was ready to move. Jack came back from town with the letter posted, and something else in his expression that she noticed immediately. "What?" she said. "Ran into something in town." He sat down. One of Kane's men was at the saloon, talking loud enough to be heard. "About what?" "About you." He kept his voice level. "Saying that the widow Caldwell's been letting a criminal sleep in her barn. Saying I was fired from Western Land for stealing documents. That the papers I gave you were taken unlawfully, and that anything built on them would be tainted evidence." The kitchen went quiet. Abigail stopped moving. Sarah looked at him. "Is that true? Were you fired?" "No. Direct and immediate. I resigned. I walked out. I have a letter of resignation in my bag, dated the 14th of April. He paused. "But Kane doesn't need it to be true. He just needs enough people to say it that Merritt hears it before we get to him. Merritt already has my letter. He's already agreed to take the case. Lawyers can change their minds." She thought about that. Could he make it stick? The stolen documents claim? He could make it complicated. If a sheriff's deputy shows up at Merritt's door before we do and tells him the documents were improperly obtained, Merritt has to, at minimum, ask questions. That slows things down. 24 days now. Every delay was a gift to Kane. "Then we go to Cheyenne earlier," she said. "Not 10 days. 5. Jack looked at her. "Your ribs aren't healed either," he said. And the echo of what she'd said to him 2 days ago was so precise that Abigail made a sound that was almost a laugh, despite herself. Sarah's expression didn't move, but something in her eyes did. "I'll manage." "I know you will," he said. Quiet, without irony. They left on a Tuesday, before the town was awake. Sarah, Jack, and Abigail in the wagon, with the oilskin package in the locked strongbox under the seat, and Sarah's rifle across her knees and Jack handling the reins, with his ribs strapped tight under his shirt. They took the creek road south to avoid the main passage through Harlow, then cut east to join the Cheyenne Trail at the crossroads. Nobody stopped them. The drive was 2 days. They camped the first night off the road in the cottonwoods, built a fire,
ate salt pork and biscuits that Abigail
This
had
story
packed,
was posted on
and
the
sat in
channel
the warmth
West
of
of
it
Betrayal.
without talking much.
Please do not repost it
At some
in any
point,
form.
Sarah looked up and found Jack watching the tree line with the focused stillness of a man who had spent the last 3 months sleeping in barns and on roads and had learned to read the dark. "You think they'll follow us?" she said. "I think we'll know by morning." They didn't. The second day, the road was clear and hot and long, and by late afternoon, Cheyenne rose up in front of them, bigger and louder than Harlow by a factor of 10. And Abigail sat up straighter and looked at everything with the wide-eyed attention of a girl who had spent most of her life in a small valley. Merritt's office was on the second floor of a building on Warren Avenue, a neat, serious room with law books on 3 walls and a man behind the desk who was 50-something, compact, with a particular watchful quality of someone who had spent decades listening to people tell him things and deciding what was true. He shook Sarah's hand first, then Jack's, then Abigail's. "Sit down, Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Let's see what you've brought me." He read for 40 minutes. Sarah and Jack and Abigail sat in the 3 chairs across from his desk and didn't speak while he went through every page. He made notes. He went back and reread certain sections. He held 2 pages up to the window light for a long moment that Sarah couldn't interpret. Then he set everything down and folded his hands. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "you processed this transaction personally?" "I handled the initial filing when the note was first purchased from Western Land. The alteration was done afterward, by someone above me." Jack named the man. Merritt wrote it down. "I can identify the handwriting on the altered figures and the signature on the authorization memo." "You'd testify to that?" "Yes." Merritt looked at him steadily. "You understand that testifying against former employers in a fraud case carries personal risk. They will come after your credibility." "I know." "They'll say you stole those documents." "I resigned. I have documentation." "They'll say you're lying." Jack's jaw was set. "Then I'll keep telling the truth until someone believes it." Merritt held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Caldwell, the alteration is clear. The original principle and the modified figure are in different ink, slightly different pen pressure, made at a different time than the surrounding text. A handwriting examiner will confirm that in an hour." He paused. "The authorization signature is from a man I know. He has been involved in 2 other cases I've heard of, but never been able to prove. If we can tie him to this transaction with a live witness and original documentation—" He stopped. "Can we win?" Sarah asked. "I don't use that word before a case is filed." He picked up his pen. "But I will tell you that I have not seen evidence this clean in 11 years of practice." He looked at her directly. "The note is fraudulent. The debt is not valid. And if Cyrus Kane bought that note knowing it had been altered, he is not just a creditor trying to collect. He is a participant in the fraud." The room was absolutely still. Abigail's
This
hand
story was
found her
posted
mother's
on
arm.
the channel West of Betrayal.
"File it."
Please do not
Sarah said.
repost it in any form.
Merritt filed the petition the next morning with the territorial court. He filed it as an emergency motion to void a fraudulent instrument and to enjoin any foreclosure action pending resolution. The judge, an older man named Carver, who Merritt had known for 20 years, reviewed it the same afternoon. The injunction was granted by 4 o'clock. Cyrus Kane could not foreclose. Not in 23 days, not in any days, until the court had reviewed the evidence and made its ruling. The foreclosure clock that had been hanging over Sarah's family for 2 months had stopped. Sarah was standing in the hallway outside Carver's courtroom when Merritt came out with the paper in his hand and told her. She didn't cry. She had known she wouldn't, and she didn't. But she put one hand flat against the wall and stood there for a moment and breathed. and Abigail pressed close beside her and put both arms around her waist, the way she hadn't done since she was small. And Sarah held her daughter there in the hallway of the territorial court and let herself breathe. Jack was standing 6 feet away, hat in hand, watching them with an expression that he wasn't working to control. Open and quiet, and something close to relief, but also something else that Sarah caught when she looked over Abigail's shoulder. Something older than relief. Something that looked like a man seeing, maybe for the first time in a long while, a thing he'd helped build, instead of one he'd helped tear down. She held his gaze for a moment. He looked away first. They started back the next morning. The drive home was different from the drive out. Quieter. Not from tension, but from the particular exhaustion of people who have been holding themselves tight for a very long time, and are only now, slowly, beginning to let go. Abigail fell asleep against the side of the wagon within an hour. Sarah sat beside Jack on the bench, with the strong box empty at their feet, and the summer road stretching out ahead of them. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah said, "What happens now? With you?" He didn't answer right away. The horses moved, the road unwound. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether you want me to stay." She looked at the road, not at him. "You said you were going county to county, finding families with altered notes." "There's one other case I know of, over in Carbon County." He paused. "It can wait." "Jack." "Mrs. Caldwell." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the road, both hands on the reins, jaw set in the familiar way, and she studied the side of his face. The healed cut above his eye, the faded bruising, the steadiness that she had spent weeks deciding whether to trust, and had decided, somewhere along the line, without making a formal decision at all. "The case isn't done," she said. "No." "Kane will fight it." "He will." "Merritt says it could take months, maybe into the fall." "Most likely." "Then I need someone on the property who knows what they're doing while I'm dealing with court business." She kept her voice practical, the way she kept everything. "The cattle need managing, and the north pasture fence still needs 2 new posts, and I haven't had a full hand since March." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to stay out of sentiment," she said. "I'm asking because the ranch needs the work, and you do the work, and I trust your hands." A long pause. "You trust my hands," he repeated. "Don't read more into it than I said." He looked at her then, and there was the almost smile, the one that had started barely there in the first days, and had grown, she realized, quite a bit since then. "Yes, ma'am. Just the hands." "Good." They rode in silence for a while. Then he said, "For what it's worth." "What?" "I'm sorry. For what I was part of. For Robert's note and for every note like it. I know that saying it doesn't change anything, and I know it doesn't give back what your family spent 8 months under." He kept his eyes on the road. "But I needed to say it plainly, not as explanation, just as what it is." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The wagon rolled on. Abigail slept. The summer afternoon pressed warm and bright around them. "Robert used to say," she said finally, "that a man isn't measured by what he does when things are easy. He's measured by what he does when it costs him something." She paused. "You lost your job. You spent your savings on freight runs. You took a beating on a road and came back anyway." She looked straight ahead. "I'm not saying it makes us even, but I'm saying I see it." He didn't say anything to that, but she felt him, just slightly, let out a breath he'd been holding for longer than this conversation.
This story was posted on the channel west of
They
Betrayal.
were a day's
Please
ride
do
from
not
home
repost it
when the
in any
rider caught
form.
up to them. Fast horse, pushing hard.
Sarah heard it before she saw it, and her hand went to the rifle across her knees in the automatic way that 3 years of managing a ranch alone had built into her. Jack pulled the horses up. Abigail woke. The rider was young, 20 at most, and he pulled up hard and said, "Mrs. Caldwell?" "Yes." "Message from Mr. Merritt." He was breathing hard, had clearly ridden through the night. He held out an envelope. "He said to get it to you fast as I could." Sarah took it and broke the seal and read it. Then she read it again. "What is it?" Abigail said. Sarah looked up. Kane went to the judge, tried to get the injunction overturned. He brought his own lawyers from Denver. She paused. Merritt says the judge held it. Injunction stands. Abigail exhaled. "Then it's fine." "There's more." Sarah kept reading. Kane's Denver lawyers filed a counter-motion. They're claiming the documents were obtained through industrial espionage. They named Jack. She looked at him across Abigail's shoulder. "They're asking the sheriff to detain him for questioning when we get back to the county." The road was quiet. Jack's expression had gone still in the old way. Not closed exactly, but back behind glass. "All right," he said. "All right?" Abigail stared at him. "They want to arrest you." "They want to slow us down. Detaining me for questioning isn't an arrest." He looked at Sarah. "It won't hold. Merritt knows it won't hold. But it will take time, and time is what Kane's buying," Sarah finished. "Yes." She looked at the letter again, at Merritt's handwriting, neat and careful. At the bottom he had written, "Come directly to my office when you reach Cheyenne jurisdiction. Do not stop in Harlow." She looked at the rider. "Tell Mr. Merritt we're coming." The boy turned his horse and went back the way he'd come. Sarah folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She looked at Jack. He was watching her with that face he had, the one that didn't perform, that just waited to see what she decided. "We're not going through Harlow," she said. "No." "We're going straight to Cheyenne." "Yes." "They can't detain you inside Merritt's office." "No, they can't." "Then that's where we go." She looked at Abigail. "You all right?" Her daughter's face was set in a way that reminded Sarah so sharply of Robert that it stole her breath for a moment. That same jaw, that same forward-looking steadiness, the particular courage of someone who has decided. "I'm fine," Abigail said. "Let's go." Sarah nodded, looked at Jack. "Drive." He drove. The wagon moved forward on the road toward Cheyenne, toward a courtroom and a lawyer and a judge who had already held their case once against the weight of Cyrus Kane's money. And Sarah sat with the rifle across her knees, and the documents gone from the strongbox, but not gone from the world. Out there now, in the hands of a man who knew what they meant.
This story was posted
And she
on the
thought
channel
about
west
Robert
of
saying
Betrayal.
a man is measured
Please
by
do not
what it costs
repost it
him.
in any form.
She thought about what this had cost her. She thought about what it was going to be worth. They reached Cheyenne by mid-morning of the next day. Merritt was waiting at the door of his office when the wagon pulled up, which told Sarah everything about how seriously he was taking the counter-motion. He came down the steps before they had fully stopped and spoke in a low, fast voice. "Good, you came straight through." He glanced at Jack. "Any trouble on the road?" "No," Sarah said. "Talk to us." They went upstairs. Merritt closed the door and stood in front of his desk rather than behind it. The posture of a man who needed to move while he thought. Kane's Denver lawyers filed the espionage claim yesterday at 4 in the afternoon. The sheriff in Harlow received a copy this morning with a request to hold Mr. Callahan for questioning pending investigation. He looked at Jack. "You are not under arrest. You have not been charged. A request for questioning is not an order of detention."
But if you set foot in Harlow County before this counter-motion is dismissed, there is a real possibility that Sheriff Briggs, who has received Kane's hospitality on more than one occasion, will interpret the request broadly. Can they get the documents thrown out? Abigail asked. They're going to try. Merritt sat on the edge of his desk. Their argument is that Mr. Callahan took proprietary company documents without authorization when he left Western Land's employ.
If they can establish that, a judge could rule the documents inadmissible.
But I resigned, Jack said. I gave proper notice. I didn't steal anything. I kept copies of transactions I personally handled. My own work records. I know, and that's exactly the argument we'll make. Merritt picked up a document from the desk. I've already drafted the response. The law is clear that an employee retains the right to copies of work they personally performed, particularly when that work is relevant to criminal activity they witnessed. He paused. But here's the thing, Mrs. Caldwell. Kane's lawyers are not stupid. They know this argument won't win in court. What they're doing is buying time and muddying the water. How much time do we have? Sarah asked. The court has scheduled a hearing on the counter-motion for Friday. 3 days. Merritt set the document down. If we survive Friday, the fraud case proceeds, and Kane has nothing left to throw at us.
If we don't, we survive Friday, Sarah said. Merritt looked at her. There's one more thing. He said it with the particular careful tone of a man delivering news he's been sitting with for a while. The man whose signature is on the authorization memo. The one who signed off on altering Robert's note. His name is Edmund Creel. He left Western Land 8 months ago. He paused. He is currently in Cheyenne, working for a freight company on the south side. The room went still. Jack's head came up. He's here, Jack said. Not a question. The particular flatness of someone recalibrating fast. He's here. Merritt looked at him steadily. If we could put him on the stand, Mrs. Caldwell's case becomes bulletproof. A live witness who can confirm the alteration and identify who ordered it is worth 10 times the documents alone. He won't testify, Jack said immediately. Creel he's not brave. He did what he was told and he's been running from it since. That's why he left Denver. People who are running from something, Merritt said carefully, sometimes run toward the truth when the alternative is running forever. Sarah looked between them. Can we find him? Jack found him in 2 hours. He went alone, over Sarah's objection, because he said Creel would bolt if he saw a woman and a lawyer coming at him, and he'd known the man for 2 years and knew how he needed to be approached. Sarah stood at the window of Merritt's office and watched the street below, and told herself she was not waiting the way she was waiting. Abigail sat beside her. He'll come back. I know. With Creel. We don't know that. Mama. Abigail's voice was quiet but certain. He will. Sarah looked at her daughter, this girl who had her father's eyes and her mother's jaw, and something entirely her own in between, something forged out of a hard year that had asked too much of her and found her equal to it anyway. When did you get so sure about him? Sarah asked. Abigail was quiet for a moment. The day he came back from the freight run, with the broken ribs. He didn't have to come back. He had the $32. He could have kept going to the next county. She paused. He came back. Sarah turned back to the window. That doesn't mean... I know what it means and what it doesn't. Abigail folded her hands in her lap. I'm 16, not 6. Sarah almost smiled. I know that too. Jack came back in 2 hours and 8 minutes, and he was not alone. Edmund Creel was a thin man, 50 or so, with the particular look of someone who had spent a significant portion of time trying to be invisible. He walked with his shoulders forward and his eyes moving, and when he came into Merritt's office, he stopped just inside the door
and looked around the room like a man checking for exits. He looked at Jack first, then Sarah, then Merritt, then at the documents on the desk, and something in his face changed. The specific expression of a person who recognizes something they hoped they'd never see again. "Mr. Creel," Merritt said, "sit down." Creel sat. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor, and said nothing. Jack sat against the wall and also said nothing, leaving it to Merritt. "I'm not here to threaten you," Merritt said. "I'm here because a woman named Sarah Caldwell has been carrying a debt that was manufactured in that office in Denver, and because the man who manufactured it is now trying to use the courts to bury the evidence before it reaches a judge. And because you signed the authorization." Creel's jaw worked. "I was told it was a standard amendment." "You knew it wasn't." A long silence. "They told me it was within the company's rights." His voice was thin and tight. "Post-mortem debt restructuring, they called it. The borrower was dead. They said, 'You knew it wasn't standard,'" Merritt said again. "Not hard, just final." Another silence. Longer. Sarah looked at this man who had sat in an office 8 months ago and signed a paper that had taken her daughter's sleep and her own peace, and 8 months of her life she would never get back. And she felt the anger move through her, clean and sharp. And she let it move, and then she let it go, because she did not have room for anything that wasn't useful right now. "Mr. Creel," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to do this for me. I don't know you, and I have no reason to think you owe me anything, though I could make an argument that you do." She kept her voice level. "I'm asking because there are other families, in Colorado and Nebraska, and whatever county Kane moves to next. And every note he holds that was altered the same way is another family that ends up where I've been standing." She paused. "You left Denver 8 months ago. You came to Cheyenne. You've been working freight and staying quiet, and I understand why. But quiet doesn't stop him." Creel looked at his hands. "He'll come after me," he said, "if I testify. Merritt will put protections in place. Your testimony will be on the record. That's its own protection." She paused. "And Kane is going to be very busy defending himself in court. He won't have much room to come after anyone." A long pause stretched across the room. Then Creel looked at Merritt. "If I testify, what happens to me?" "You're a witness, not a defendant. You acted under instruction and left when you understood the full scope of what was happening. I can structure your testimony to make that clear." Merritt's voice was careful and professional. "I cannot guarantee you face no consequences, but I can tell you that cooperating witnesses in fraud cases are treated very differently from the men who ordered the fraud." Creel looked at Jack. "You're doing this too? Testifying?" "Already agreed to it." "They'll go after you hard." "I know." Jack met his eyes.
This story
Doesn't
was
change
posted
anything.
on the channel
Something
west
shifted in
of
Creel's
Betrayal.
face.
Please do not repost
The calculation
it
of
in
a
any
man who
form.
has been running and is tired of it, and is looking at another man who stopped running and trying to understand how that feels. "All right," he said. "All right." Friday came fast. The courtroom was small and warm, already crowded by the time Sarah and Abigail arrived. Kane's Denver lawyers were 2 men in good suits who sat very straight and spoke with the clipped precision of people who were accustomed to winning on procedure. Kane himself sat behind them, and Sarah felt his eyes on her when she walked in. Flat and measuring. The eyes of a man who was still running the numbers. She sat down and looked straight ahead and did not look at him again. The hearing opened with Kane's lawyers arguing that the documents had been taken in violation of the confidentiality agreements signed by Western Land employees, that the chain of custody was compromised, and that a case built on unlawfully obtained materials could not stand. Merritt stood up and took them apart, piece by piece. He established that Jack's employment contract did not prohibit retention of work records pertaining to potential criminal activity.
He cited 2 territorial precedents. He submitted Jack's letter of resignation with its date and counter-signature from the company's own office manager. He argued that an employee who witnesses fraud and retains evidence of that fraud is not a thief. He is a witness. The judge, Carver, asked questions. Sharp ones. He asked Kane's lawyers twice to clarify their position on the confidentiality clause, and both times they gave answers that were longer than they needed to be, which was the particular sign of a legal argument that doesn't hold weight. Then Merritt called Jack to the stand. Jack walked up and sat down and answered every question in the same voice he used for everything. Level, direct, without performance. He described the original transaction. He described the altered figures. He named the man who had authorized the change, and he identified the handwriting. And he said clearly and without hesitation that he had been present when the altered documentation was sent back to be attached to the Caldwell note. Kane's lawyers cross-examined for 40 minutes. They went after his character, his resignation, his motives, his relationship with Mrs. Caldwell. Jack answered every question. He didn't get angry. He didn't get careful. He just kept telling the truth in the same voice until there was nothing left to attack. Then Merritt called Edmund Creel. The courtroom shifted. Sarah felt it, the particular atmospheric change of a room realizing that something unexpected has walked in. Kane's lawyers looked at each other. Kane himself leaned forward in his chair and said something in a low, urgent voice to the man beside him. Creel sat in the witness chair and looked like a man who had made a decision he was committed to keeping. He testified for 25 minutes. He confirmed the alteration. He confirmed the authorization signature. He named the man who had given the order, not just his title, but his name and the date of the meeting, and the specific instruction given, word for word, because Creel had apparently spent 8 months not forgetting any of it. When Kane's lawyers stood to cross-examine, the lead attorney looked at his notes for a long moment and then said, "No questions, Your Honor." The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Carver looked over his glasses at both tables. "I've heard enough," he said. "The counter motion is denied. The documents are admissible. This court finds sufficient evidence of fraudulent alteration of a debt instrument to proceed to full hearing." He looked directly at Kane's table. "I will also note that this court takes a very serious view of attempts to use procedural motions to delay justice in cases of alleged fraud against private citizens." He set his pen down. "We're adjourned until the full hearing, which I am scheduling for the 17th. He stood. Everyone stood. Sarah sat for 1 extra second and breathed. Outside the courtroom, Abigail grabbed her hand and held it tight. And Sarah held back, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything adequate to say. Merritt came out behind them and shook Sarah's hand and said, "The 17th. We'll be ready." Jack came out last. He stopped on the steps, and Abigail turned and said, "You were good in there," with the frank honesty of a 16-year-old who hasn't learned yet to soften a compliment. And he said, "Thank you, Miss Abigail." And she gave him the brief, private smile of someone who has decided a thing about a person and is satisfied with the decision. Then she said, "I'm going to get water," and walked toward the pump across the street with the perfect precision of someone removing herself from a conversation on purpose. Sarah watched her go with a look that knew exactly what her daughter was doing. Jack stood beside her on the steps. "The 17th is 3 weeks out," he said. "I know. The injunction holds until then. The ranch is safe. For now." Sarah. He used her name the way he'd started to. Not casually, but deliberately, like a door he had learned to knock on instead of push. "It's going to hold." She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No, but Carver's not a man who undecides things. And Kane knows it. Did you see his face when Creel sat down?" She had. She'd been watching. He looked like a man counting what it was going to cost him. That's because he was. She turned and looked out at the street. The summer afternoon, ordinary and bright. People moving past with their ordinary business. None of them knowing that something had just shifted in a small courtroom above them that was going to matter to a lot of families in a lot of counties. "What happens to Creel?" she asked. "Merritt's working on it. He'll be all right." Jack paused. "He did the right thing." "He did." She was quiet for a moment. "It took him a while. Most right things do." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the street, hands in his pockets, the summer light on his face showing every line that the last year had put there. The road, the weather, the particular cost of carrying something heavy for a long time. "You'll come back to the ranch," she said. It wasn't a question this time. "If you'll have me." "I told you. The north fence needs 2 new posts." "Yes, ma'am." "And the cattle need managing through fall." "Yes, ma'am." She looked back at the street. "The 17th gives us 3 weeks. I want to use them." "For what?" "For everything the last 8 months took." She said it plainly. "The garden's behind. The barn roof needs checking. I want to ride the full property line before the hearing and know exactly what I'm fighting for. Not from a ledger, not from memory. I want to ride it and see it." She paused. "I'd like company for that." He turned and looked at her then. Not the almost smile, the real one, the one she'd seen exactly twice before, once in the doctor's office in Harlow, and once, very briefly, at the kitchen table the night he'd talked for 2 hours. It changed his face considerably. "I reckon I can manage that," he said. They rode the property line on a Sunday, 10 days before the hearing. All 3 of them, Sarah and Abigail and Jack, on horseback, starting at the north corner and working east in the early morning before the heat had fully built. Abigail rode ahead, which she'd started doing lately, giving them room that Sarah had decided not to comment on. They rode the eastern boundary in companionable quiet, checking posts, noting the ones that needed attention, and somewhere along the way, Sarah stopped talking about the fence and started talking about Robert. She hadn't planned to. It came out the way things did when you were moving and not looking at the person beside you, and the particular quality of the morning made honesty easier than silence. She told him about how Robert had been with the horses, patient in a way he wasn't with much else. How he'd taught Abigail to ride before she could reliably walk. How he'd made decisions that were wrong and kept things from Sarah that he shouldn't have. And how she'd been furious at him for months after he died.
This story
And how
was
that
posted
fury
on the channel
had eventually
west of
turned into
Betrayal.
something more
Please do
complicated
not repost
that wasn't
it in any
forgiveness
form.
exactly, because she didn't think he'd done anything that needed forgiving, but was more like a full accounting, the whole man, not just the grief. Jack listened. He didn't try to fill the spaces. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He sounds like someone who wanted to protect people so much. He forgot to let them help him." Sarah looked at the fence line. "That's exactly right." "I understand that particular failing," he said. Quiet, not pointed. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road ahead, jaw set in the familiar way, and she thought about a man who had walked away from money and position and spent 3 months on broken roads and worn-out boots trying to fix something one family at a time, without telling any of them who he used to be. She thought about $60 offered as not charity, and freight runs with cracked ribs and documents wrapped in oilskin behind a barn post. "Jack," she said. "Ma'am?" "You're going to stop calling me ma'am eventually." A pause. "Probably," he said. "Eventually." She looked straight ahead and said nothing more, and the horses moved forward, and ahead of them, Abigail was riding the fence line in the summer morning, with her back straight and her father's eyes watching everything.
The hearing on the 17th lasted 4 hours. Merritt presented the documents, the expert handwriting analysis, Jack's testimony, and Creel's testimony in sequence, clean and unassailable. Kane's lawyers pushed back on every point, with the professional persistence of men being paid well to do so. The judge asked questions. Witnesses were examined and cross-examined. The court took a recess at noon. When they reconvened, Judge Carver spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. He found the debt instrument fraudulent. He found the alteration willful and deliberate. He found that Cyrus Kane had purchased the note with full knowledge of the alteration, citing correspondence between Kane and the Denver office that Merritt had subpoenaed. He voided the note entirely. The debt was gone. Not reduced, not restructured. Gone, erased as if it had never existed, which in the eyes of the court, it hadn't, because the original legitimate debt of $200 at 8% had been paid in full 2 years prior from the sale of Robert's mining equipment, a fact buried in the same documents that Creel had helped surface. Robert had paid his debt. He died, not knowing it had been paid, because someone had already been building a new one on top of the ashes of the first. Sarah sat in that courtroom and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not triumph, not relief. Something more complete than either. The particular feeling of a thing being corrected that should never have been wrong. Justice was too large a word. This was smaller and more real than justice. This was Robert's name being given back to him. She kept her face still. She always kept her face still. But she felt it. Kane was charged with fraud the following week. The Denver man, the one who had authorized the alteration, was charged separately. Creel cooperated fully and received, as Merritt had promised, the consideration of a cooperative witness. Sarah heard about the charges from Merritt's letter and read it at the kitchen table, and then folded it and put it with the other papers in the tin box behind the hearthstone. Then she went outside. Jack was at the south fence, fixing the last of the posts that needed replacing. He'd been working steadily since they got back, the kind of work that settled into the rhythm of the ranch, the way a person settles into a chair they've sat in for years. Easy, without thinking about it. Abigail was in the garden, which she'd taken over completely in the last 2 weeks, with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. Sarah stood at the fence beside him and held out Merritt's letter without a word. He read it, set it on the post, picked up the tamping rod. "It's over," she said. "Most of it." He set the rod down and looked at her. "The court case will drag on for a while, but your part of it's done." "Our part," she said. He looked at her. "Our part is done," she said. Steady, deliberate. The way she said everything that mattered. Something in his face opened up the way it had outside the courtroom on the steps. Not the almost smile, but the real one. And alongside it something else. Something that had been there for a while in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The way he stayed close without crowding. The way he said her name like it cost him something each time, and he paid it willingly. "Sarah," he said her name. "Jack." He looked at her for a long moment. The summer afternoon pressed warm around them, the cattle in the far field.
Abigail's voice calling something from the garden that neither of them could quite make out. "I'd like to stay," he said. "Not if you'll have me this time. Not conditional. Just a man saying a plain, true thing to a woman he'd stopped pretending with." She looked at him, at his face, his hands, the man who had walked up a dusty road with nothing but knowledge and the intention to do something with it, who had sat at her table and eaten her cornbread and gotten beaten on a road and come back and stood in a courtroom and told the truth until there was nothing left standing in the way of it. "I know you would," she said. "Is that an answer?" She picked up the tamping rod and handed it to him. "The west post is still loose. You're going to want to set it before the ground dries any harder." He looked at her, looked at the rod, took it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. But he was smiling when he said it, the full, real thing. And she walked back toward the house with the letter in her hand and the sun on her back, and the ranch spreading out around her in every direction, whole and hers, and no one else's. Abigail fell into step beside her from the garden path. "Well? Well, what? Is he staying?" Sarah looked straight ahead. "He's fixing the west post." Abigail looked back over her shoulder at Jack working the fence line, then looked at her mother and smiled with her father's eyes and her own particular certainty. "Good," she said. "That post's been loose since March." Sarah said nothing, but she let herself feel it, the warmth of it, the full solid weight of a day that had come out the way it was supposed to, of a name restored and a debt erased, and a ranch still standing in the summer heat, with the spring running clean and clear through the low meadow, and belonging to no one but the woman who had refused, every single day of a very long 8 months, to let it go. That was what it meant to own a thing worth keeping. Not the paper, not the legal instrument, not the money or the leverage, or the quiet life that asked nothing of you. It meant standing on the land in the heat of the day and choosing it again, the same as you chose it the first time, knowing everything it had cost and choosing it still. Sarah Caldwell walked back to her house, and the door closed behind her, and the ranch was hers.